All right, ready to dive deep. Today, we're going back to early Islamic history. We're going to uncover the story of Abdullah ibn Rawaha,
Ah, Abdullah ibn Rawaha.
one of the three poets of the Prophet Muhammad,
Yes.
as Dr. Omar Silman calls them in his lecture.
Right from the start, we see this really interesting
Well,
paradox.
mm,
Here we have this well-known poet, someone whose words, I mean, back then would have been a weapon in themselves, but he
mhm,
picks up an actual sword and becomes a warrior.
interesting.
That's pretty unusual, even for that era.
For sure. Definitely not your, typical poet like scribbling away in some ivory tower.
Right.
Dr. Suleiman's lecture really paints a picture of Abdullah as this uh, incredibly sharp, multi-talented guy.
Mm.
I mean, even before he converted to Islam, his poetry was so well known
Oh, yeah.
that even the Prophet himself was familiar with his work.
Yeah, and that speaks to a level of talent that transcended, I mean, even the deep tribal divisions of the time.
Yeah, for sure.
And when Abdullah actually met the prophet for the first time, it said that he instantly recognized him as a prophet.
Wow, talk about intuition, right?
Yeah, what was that moment like? Right. This wasn't someone slowly convinced over time. It
Right?
was immediate recognition.
Yeah.
And it seems like that recognition really fueled his actions because Abdullah was among the very first to embrace Islam and pledge his allegiance to the prophet.
Yeah, that swiftness of action, that's something we see throughout Abdullah's life.
Interesting.
He wasn't just a poet composing these beautiful verses. He was a trusted advisor. He was a diplomat. He was sent to negotiate with different tribes. And get this, he was even tasked with estimating the spoils of war, like figuring out how many palm trees belonged to the Muslims after a victory.
Wait, hold on. They put a poet in charge of inventory?
Yeah.
You think they'd want someone with a head for numbers, not rhymes?
Well, the sources say that Abdullah had a knack for both.
It is fascinating how his talents were recognized and utilized in these very practical ways. You got to remember, this is a time when battles were fought and societies were built with both sword and word.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you really appreciate how multifaceted people were back then. You couldn't just be good at one thing, you know.
Right.
You had to wear many hats. And Abdullah's courage is evident from early on.
Mm.
Dr. Suleiman, he mentions this story about Abdullah confronting a powerful leader in Medina, Abdullah ibn Ubay.
Right.
This guy was known to be hostile towards the Prophet.
Yeah, he was a tough guy, held a lot of sway.
Yeah.
But when Ibn Ubay publicly insulted the prophet, Abdullah ibn Rad didn't even hesitate to stand up in his defense.
Well.
And this was before the Muslims even had established a strong foothold in Medina. So, I mean, that was a bold act. It demonstrates, remarkable loyalty and fearlessness.
Absolutely. So we've got a quick thinker, brave, loyal to the Prophet, and of course, a gifted poet. But I'm guessing his poetry wasn't just flowery language. Like, it actually served a purpose within the growing Muslim community.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. His poetry, I mean, it took many forms. You had praises for the prophet, arguments against those who mocked the new faith, and even battle cries to rally the Muslims during times of war. Imagine, your words having the power to sway hearts, inspire bravery, or even, change the course of a battle.
Yeah, talk about pressure.
Yeah.
Dr. Suleiman actually shares kind of a lighter moment in his lecture. There's this story about the Prophet challenging Abdullah to compose a poem on the spot.
Oh, yeah.
And apparently Abdullah kind of stumbles at first.
I did.
Which I think is kind of endearing. It shows that even this master poet had moments of, doubt.
Right. It humanizes him.
Yeah.
Right. He wasn't, some flawless superhuman.
Right.
But what's beautiful is how the prophet encouraged him. And ultimately, Abdullah delivers this moving and impactful poem. It speaks to the kind of relationship they had.
For sure. And that relationship really shines through in one of the most powerful stories from Dr. Suleiman's lecture. During the Battle of the Trench,
Oh, yes.
when the Muslims were, just exhausted and facing this massive enemy force, the Prophet himself began singing one of Abdullah's poems.
Yeah. And here's where Abdullah's genius as a poet and, his understanding of the human spirit truly come to light.
Yeah.
Picture this. The Muslims they're digging trenches for defense. They're exhausted. They're outnumbered.
Right.
The mood is tense. Fear is, palpable. And then the prophet starts reciting these verses, these powerful verses, infusing them with his own spirit.
Wow. So it wasn't just a poem anymore. It became like this prayer,
Yes.
this shared expression of faith and resilience in the face of, such danger.
Exactly, yeah. And just imagine the impact that this had on the Muslims. I mean, Abdullah's words amplified by the Prophet's voice. Must have been electrifying. It's a real testament to the power of poetry to uplift, to inspire, and to, even give strength in the most challenging circumstances.
Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing how, like, these words crafted in such a different time and place, they still have so much power.
They do.
But Dr. Suleiman emphasizes that Abdullah wasn't just known for those powerful, like, battle cries. He was also a man of deep piety.
Yes, and that piety, was expressed in some pretty interesting ways.
Oh.
Dr. Silman tells this story that I think really captures Abdullah's eagerness to follow the prophets, like every
Mhm.
instruction, even if it meant, well, looking a bit silly.
Okay. I'm hooked. What did he do?
So imagine this, right? The prophet is giving a sermon inside the mosque.
Okay.
As people are, gathering, he tells everyone to sit down.
Okay.
Abdullah happens to be arriving late,
Uh-huh.
and all he hears is the prophet saying, "Sit down."
Hmm. So what does he do? Like, takes a seat right there in the courtyard?
Exactly. Right there in the scorching sun.
Wow.
Of course, the prophet meant for those inside the mosque to sit, but Abdullah, in his eagerness to obey, takes the instruction, well, pretty literally.
That's hilarious.
It is.
But, it also speaks to, like, a deep sincerity.
Yeah.
It wasn't about showing off his piety. It was about, like, genuine obedience.
Absolutely.
And this deep devotion, it seems to have, like, affected even how he viewed his poetry.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Dr. Suleiman points out that, Abdullah was really troubled when he heard a verse in the Quran that mentions poets being followed by those who go astray.
Huh.
He actually wept and prayed for reassurance from God that, his poetry wasn't leading people down the wrong path.
That's a very human reaction.
Yeah,
Especially for someone who, like, clearly saw his poetry as a tool for good.
right.
To worry that his gift could be, like, misused or misinterpreted, it must have been a heavy burden.
It was a heavy burden. And, it reminds us that even the most devout individuals, they experience these moments of doubt and insecurity.
Yeah.
Thankfully, a later verse clarifies that those who believe and do good deeds aren't included in that category of, misguided poets.
Right.
But the fact that he wrestled with this, that really shows his sincerity.
Absolutely. Makes me think about the responsibility that comes with, any gift or talent, even something as seemingly harmless as poetry.
Right.
But speaking of responsibility, we can't talk about Abdullah without discussing his role in one of the most challenging battles the early Muslims faced, the Battle of Mu'tah.
Yeah, this battle's significant for a lot of reasons. It was, it was the first major confrontation between the Muslims and the Byzantine Empire.
Wow.
A clash of empires, if you will. And Dr. Suleiman, he highlights just how outnumbered the Muslim army was.
Yeah.
3,000 men against a Byzantine force estimated at 200,000.
Those are some daunting odds. Like, what led to such a clash?
Well, it was sparked by, the murder of the Prophet's ambassador to the Ghassanids. They were allies of the Byzantines. It was a clear act of aggression that couldn't be ignored. The Prophet, understanding, the gravity of the situation, he appointed 3 leaders for the army.
And this is where Abdullah's story takes another remarkable turn. He was chosen as the 3rd leader. I mean,
Yep.
This signifies his high standing,
Absolutely.
the trust placed in him by the Prophet. But what's truly, I think, awe-inspiring is what happens next.
Yeah, the battle was, it was fierce. And the first 2 leaders, Zayd ibn Haritha, he was the Prophet's adopted son, and Jafar ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin.
Right.
Both of them were martyred. Can you imagine the weight of responsibility that then fell on Abdullah's shoulders?
It must have been, crushing. Leading an outnumbered army into battle is hard enough, but to do so after witnessing the deaths of 2 such prominent figures, like, that's unimaginable.
It is, and yet Abdullah, he rose to the occasion. Despite his own fear, he took command, and he began chanting poetry to rally the troops, urging them to fight for their faith and their community.
So it's like poetry became his weapon once again.
Yeah.
But not to, like, strike down enemies, but to bolster the spirits of his comrades.
Precisely, yeah. Dr. Suleiman, he describes the scene with such vividness. You can almost hear Abdullah's voice like ringing out over the battlefield. His words just, a source of courage and defiance in the face of death.
Wow.
And while, the Muslim army ultimately retreated, their bravery and their resilience, I mean, it really left a lasting impression.
And the prophet himself was like deeply grieved by the loss of these three leaders,
He was.
including Abdullah.
Yeah.
It speaks to the depth of their bond and the impact that they had on the early Muslim community.
Right. Their deaths weren't in vain, though. The Battle of Mu'tah, despite its heavy losses, it showed the growing strength and determination of the Muslim community, a real testament to the sacrifices made by individuals like Abdullah. But, his legacy goes beyond just, battlefield heroics.
That's right. We've talked about his intelligence, his bravery, his piety. But Dr. Suleiman also highlights like Abdullah's profound impact on those who knew him personally. It wasn't just his words that inspired, but his actions and his character.
Yeah, and one of the most, I think, touching stories from Dr. Suleiman's lecture involves Abdullah's closest friend.
Yeah.
This friend was so moved by Abdullah's death that he made it like a daily practice to pray for himself, asking God to protect him from doing anything that would, shame Abdullah in the afterlife.
Wow, that's a powerful testament to the kind of man Abdullah was.
Yeah.
To have a friend so committed to honoring his memory, striving to live in a way that would make him proud even after his death.
Mm.
It's incredibly moving.
It shows the ripple effect of, a life well lived.
Yeah.
Abdullah may have died young, but his impact, it continued to spread through the lives of those he touched. And Dr. Suleiman, he reminds us that this impact wasn't, limited to grand gestures or battlefield heroics.
This is where that story about Abdullah's widow comes in, right? The one where she describes his habit of praying 2 rakas before entering or leaving his house.
Exactly. It's such a simple detail, yet it speaks volumes about Abdullah's character.
Yeah.
It wasn't about performing piety. It was about weaving his faith into the fabric of his daily life. A small, consistent act that reveals a deep and abiding connection with the divine.
It's like those 2 rakas were a way for him to center himself, to reaffirm his commitment to his faith, no matter what challenges or triumphs the day might hold. A reminder that even amidst the chaos of life, we can always find moments to connect with something greater than ourselves.
And it makes you wonder, what small, consistent action could each of us incorporate into our lives? Inspired by Abdullah's example.
No.
What simple act could serve as our own touchstone, our own reminder to live with intention and purpose?
That's a really powerful question.
Yeah.
And I think it gets to the heart of what makes, Abdullah's story so enduring. He wasn't just a warrior or a poet.
Right.
He was a man who lived his faith.
Yes.
Not through grand pronouncements, but through small, consistent actions that reflected his deepest values.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how that, one small detail, those 2 rakas,
Right.
really give us such a powerful insight into Abdullah's, character.
It is.
And it makes me think back to, that story about his concern over the Quranic verse about misguided poets.
Right. It's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, he didn't just brush it off as like, oh, that doesn't apply to me.
Right.
Abdullah, he genuinely grappled with the, the weight of his words and the potential impact that, they could have. And that's what I find so inspiring about him. He wasn't just this talented poet.
Right.
He was a man who actively sought to align his actions with his beliefs.
Yes.
Even when it meant confronting his own, insecurities and seeking guidance from God.
It speaks to a humility that's often missing in those who, wield influence, whether it's through, words or weapons.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that true piety involves constant self-reflection.
Right.
A willingness to question ourselves and to seek guidance from a source greater than our own egos.
I'm also struck by how this commitment to his faith,
Yeah.
it wasn't just some private matter for Abdullah.
No.
It infused his leadership, his
Yeah.
interactions with others, even his actions on the battlefield.
You're right. Yeah. Dr. Suleiman, he points out a particularly poignant moment from the Battle of Mu'tah.
Okay.
As Abdullah takes command after, the deaths of the first 2 leaders, he turns to his fellow soldiers and he asks them, "Do I see you resisting paradise?"
Wow, what a powerful question to ask in the heat of battle.
Right.
It's like he's reminding them, and maybe even himself, that their ultimate goal is something far greater than, earthly victory.
Exactly. Yeah, in the face of death, he's calling them back to their higher purpose,
Yeah.
reminding them that even amidst the chaos and the fear, their actions have eternal significance.
It really makes you think about how, we approach challenges in our own lives.
Right.
Are we driven by fear, by ambition, or a deeper sense of purpose?
Abdullah's example challenges us to act with intention, even in the most difficult circumstances, remembering that our choices have, consequences that extend far beyond just the immediate moment.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from Abdullah's early life as a renowned poet
Right.
to his conversion to Islam, his close relationship with the Prophet, his bravery on the battlefield, his unwavering piety, and the profound impact he had on those around him.
And through it all, we see this fascinating interplay of strength and sensitivity,
Yeah.
action and contemplation. He wasn't just a warrior or a poet, a leader or a man of faith.
Right.
He embodied all of these qualities in a way that feels both inspiring and deeply human.
I think that's what makes Abdullah ibn Rawaha's story so compelling. He wasn't some mythical figure. He was a real person who faced real challenges, made difficult choices, and ultimately, left the world a better place because of how he chose to live.
And perhaps that's the most enduring takeaway from Dr. Suleiman's lecture, the reminder that greatness, it doesn't require grand gestures
Fair.
or extraordinary circumstances. It can be found in the everyday choices that we make,
Right.
in the small acts of courage, kindness, and integrity that shape our lives and leave a lasting impact on those around us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. What small, consistent action can you take, inspired by Abdullah's example, to bring more intention, purpose, and meaning into your own life?
Maybe it's a daily practice of, reflection or prayer.
Right.
Maybe it's a commitment to speaking up against injustice or extending a helping hand to those in need.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, may it be a reminder of the power we each possess to make a positive difference in the world, one small intentional act at a time.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life of Abdullah ibn Rawaha. Until next time, may your journey be filled with inspiration, purpose, and the pursuit of a life well lived.